what a healthy relationship looked like, and how would we know if we had achieved it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's it's a dynamic relationship that we have with China, as China's growth rates have been so extraordinary over the last several decades that even trying to project, Denmark, what are their equities in the year 2025? What are their sets of capabilities? It's as if you're trying to shoot and hit a target out there somewhere defined as a good, healthy U.S.-China military relationship, but the target's moving at the same time, and you're having to lead it in trying to think through what should this look like. I would go back to what I laid out, though, at the end of the talk in my prepared remarks, and I would argue that first and foremost, number one priority is we have to have a more serious dialogue and richer richer agreements established with the Chinese military on so-called rules of the road. We're continuing to be at risk every day that there is going to be an incident somewhere in the South China Sea. There's going to be an incident in the East China Sea. And we've been lucky. The Belgrade bombing that I referred to, that wasn't a question of rules of the road, but we were lucky that incident was contained. More recently, Hainan Island in 2001, that was Chinese interpretation of us violating what they call their rules of the road for the management of the EEZs. And we were very fortunate that did not cause more harm in the long-term relationship, although it maybe put some permanent bruises in it. And the loss there was tragically one Chinese naval fighter pilot. But we don't have a mechanism established yet that allows the Chinese militaries and the American military to sit down on a continuous basis and be very frank about their rules of the road and trying to get agreements. This is not an easy subject because we are fundamentally disagree with China of the interpretation of what kind of jurisdictions and authorities it should have for territories that it claims or EEZs that they operate within. So that you ask, what would a healthy relationship look like? That would be a relationship. That would be one area where it would be a more mature relationship, reflecting risk and dangers that are out there. Now, there's another set of Mark. There's a set of other areas where we have the possibility of building upon. But I can keep on going back to, as long as the United States military and our civilian leadership says this is the way that we should be operating and will operate, the dialogue becomes imperative. Longer term, as China continues to grow in power, it's going to want to challenge increasingly the United States' presence in the Western Pacific and how we operationalize that presence. So better for us, rather than to say to China that, look, this so-called pivot to Asia, it doesn't have a lot to do with you. It has more to do with economics and trade. It has a lot to do with that. But to say that this really isn't about you, China, when we talk about our defense strategy in the Asia-Pacific region, that's disingenuous. Mm-hmm. And for China to say that you're either trying to contain us or you have to cooperate with us, $535 billion of annual trade a year, and the Chinese are claiming this is containment, that's equally absurd. So I think get a mature relationship where the two sides, the civilian military domain, when it comes to security issues, they're looking across the table and they're telling the other side things they just really don't want to hear.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Now the floor is open for questions. We do have two student aides who have stand at the ready with microphones. So when you're called upon, if you could just wait until the mic arrives so that everybody can hear the question. And please do keep your questions short. And we'll start with Professor Manella.
Thank you for a really fascinating lecture. I was struck by that graph with the circles of military spending. I wasn't sure whether to be comforted or concerned with the size of the American ball relative to the other balls. On the one hand,
When I was wearing my military uniform, I was comforted.
on the one hand, it makes me feel very safe. On the other hand, the money's coming out of my pocket. So I'm wondering whether the ball can be a bit smaller and I'll still be safe. The question I have is, it may be naive. I'm not an expert in military affairs or strategy. I'm a historian, and sometimes it seems to me as if the current strategic discussion, or the discussion of the strategic goals or vision of the United States in East Asia, has a lot of historical inertia embedded in it. So I guess I'm wondering, I can see the historical reasons as to why, for example, the United States has troops in South Korea and Japan stationed permanently. But I'm wondering what the contemporary strategic reason is for that, whether there is any discussion about that in American military strategic circles, whether there's any serious voices who are asking the question as to whether it's possible to retain American interests or protect American interests while withdrawing these troops, and say keeping Japan and South Korea under an American nuclear umbrella. Because I'm thinking if the shoe were on the other foot and there were Chinese troops in, say, Cuba and Mexico, what would that look like from the American perspective if we were talking about a military relationship?
Yeah, those are great questions, important questions. First of all, about the 40+%. United States, do we need to be spending that much or not? I won't answer that question. What we do know is over the next 5 to 10 years, we won't be spending that much. The size of the Department of Defense is coming down. One is the Iraq-Afghanistan war, but secondly, we're just under such great fiscal pressure right now that the size of the Department of Defense has got to, and it will be reduced. My own view is that there's enough targets out there that can be removed, or enough capacities, enough organizations and structure that can be removed, that we can do that and still keep military primacy many times over. So I wouldn't disagree about your concern on the 40%, but it is coming down. On the question of legacy and historical inertia, it's fun to ask the question if there had been no Second World War, no Cold War, and we were just starting from scratch, what would United States military presence look like in the Asia Pacific area? It probably would look a lot different than it does today. We go back to starting with the Korean Peninsula, though. There's still a argument to be made for the presence that we maintain in the Korean Peninsula, in the Republic of Korea. We are still facing a pretty serious threat from North Korea. Does that have to be a lot of ground troops, or can that be primarily air and naval power? Probably you can draw numbers down on the ground forces. Does that presence that we maintain in Korea and around the Asia-Pacific area, does that cause discomfort to Beijing? Yeah, and I think it does more with each year, because they're asking the question, going beyond Korea, where they can say that, yes, they understand the logic there, the Koreans want us there. They go around the rest of the region and they see our force deployments, the level of our exercises, and they'll conclude that this is about containment of China, or it's very directed against China. You get to the question of legacy then in Japan. Well, do we need to maintain that kind of force posture there? Well, the alliance with Japan, however we defined it, you had mentioned the advantage that we provide of a nuclear umbrella, a nuclear-armed Japan, a nuclear-armed Seoul. That's not to our interest. It's not to China's interest. But do we need to maintain that force posture in Japan in order to achieve that effect? Are those questions being asked, and is there deliberation over them in the Department of Defense and our military? Yeah, with the force reductions that we've got coming up, with the budget challenges that we're facing, I think that those debates are underway. Is there going to be any kind of radical shift over the next several years? No, I don't believe so. The United States, though, what it does need in the Asia-Pacific strategy, if you believe that there's the potential for conflict, and the need for deterrence. What we do need in the Asia-Pacific region, we do need some access defined by the ability to move in and establish air power forward. We need naval access. Does that translate then into the over 100,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines that we've got in that force structure today? Probably not. But increasingly, the United States military and our Department of Defense, I think that we necessarily will not be thinking in terms of legacy. We'll be thinking legacy force structures. We'll be thinking much more in terms of where do we need to possibly have forces get to quickly in a crisis, and knowing that if they're going to be moving to a forward base somewhere, that in certain instances you'll have to maintain a full-time presence there. But that doesn't necessarily mean a lot of airmen or sailors or troops to achieve that.
Thank you. So in your list of disruptions to mill-to-mill relations, it seemed like about half of them were somewhat random events, the Belgrade embassy bombing, for example. The other half were due directly to Taiwan in one way or another. And it seems that the Taiwan issue is really not the only, but probably the major driver of this kind of disruption and conflict. And it seems similarly that our Taiwan mill-to-mill relations and Taiwan defense sales is an old policy that may be ripe for reexamination, and that it seems that this periodic, large sales cause consternation on the Chinese side, and it might be possible to change the U.S. policy, perhaps to make this kind of defense sales the new normal, rather than something that China can throw a tantrum about each time it happens. Or just more generally, I wonder what your thoughts are about U.S.-Taiwan relations and how that can still be done to ameliorate some of these conflicts while remaining true to our defense of Taiwan.
This gets back to legacy issues as well. I mentioned the Korean War. One of the great consequences of the Korean War, beyond the tragedy of the fighting and the losses on both sides, was that the United States then decided to send the 7th Fleet to intervene in the Taiwan Strait, and before that point in time had really taken more of a hands-off approach. That was a huge consequence. Of course, you look at the success that Taiwan has enjoyed, a very vibrant democracy, and you can make an argument that that was actually, in historical context, a very wise move. Look at Taiwan today. You can say, in the view of the longer-term U.S.-China relations, that did have consequences. But your question about Taiwan, we have the Taiwan Relations Act, and I talked about the role of Congress, and the Taiwan Relations Act, as everyone knows here, of 1979, stipulates that the United States has the responsibility by law to continue to provide Taiwan with the military means that they need to defend Taiwan against the PRC. And any threat against Taiwan by the PRC, we have to take that, I think the language of the Taiwan Relations Act, like most peace treaties, of serious concern. So there's a law out there that is in existence. Will the Taiwan issue, will it serve as a obstacle in the future for U.S.-China improved relations? Probably it will reappear, because periodically we're going to have to renew requests, we're going to have to review requests from Taiwan for military sales. They don't have the capability of producing what they need on their own. No other nation will sell Taiwan the weaponry except the United States, because China, with its economic clout right now, will immediately respond in kind, as has happened, say, when the Dutch contemplated military sales. How will China react the next time that we have military sales to Taiwan? It's going to depend, I think, very much on what's the overall context of the relationship at that time. Where do we stand on issues such as Chinese maritime territorial claims and relations with our allies? Where are we going to be on the Korean Peninsula at that time? Where is China at that time in terms of its own self-confidence and its economy? I do believe that under a certain scenario, China will respond very strongly. But what's interesting is where the responses, say, up through the 1990s and the early 2000 period, was very much based upon China concerned that the capabilities that the United States was agreeing to transfer to China, to Taiwan, was actually setting the PLA back militarily. Say the F-16 sales when they went forward. The PLA was concerned about the combat power that Taiwan gained from that, putting off in their minds then the possibility of having real military advantage over Taiwan. PLA capabilities are rapidly getting to a point where there is no one arms sales that the PLA will be furious about, because it actually gives a kind of military capability to Taiwan that they would worry about. It can be a nuisance, but not a great worry. So the reaction of China then will be much more politically informed in my mind. And to put all of this together then about alliance structures and Taiwan, I think that the Chinese thinking about U.S. policies towards Taiwan, these arms sales, it has less to do in their minds about preserving Taiwan independence and more of a pattern of activities in the Asia-Pacific area, in the Western Pacific, where we're putting in the pieces of a puzzle then that adds up to a containment against the People's Republic of China. And that's how they see a lot of these alliance activities as well.
Thank you very much. Egerim Shrebekov, visiting scholar at Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies from Kazakhstan. Thank you for a great talk. And my two short questions are related to the international organization's perspective, in particular NATO's expanding partnership towards Asia Pacific, which probably is fitting into the US rebalancing policy or strategy in Asia Pacific. How does NATO's partnership or alliances in Asia Pacific would fit in the context of Sino-American military relations, in your opinion? And second is related to your experience in Central Asia and Afghanistan in particular. How would you evaluate the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's role in Chinese policy in that region? Thank you very much.
Yeah, NISA's, you mentioned NISA, right? NESA?
No, Shanghai Cooperation.
No, I'm sorry, the
NATO. NATO's
Oh, NATO.
Asian Pacific.
I'm sorry, I thought I heard you say NESA. Yeah, NATO.
Whoops. Time's up.
Yeah.
Somebody must leave, must have been on the light.
I don't know that NATO has a very big future in the Asia-Pacific region. I talked about U.S. defense spending coming down, and our European allies, and to an extent Canada, their defense spending is coming down a lot more. And the alliance is going to, in my view, the alliance will be much more focused in its traditional missions around Europe. It will probably continue to have an interest in North Africa because of the southern flank of NATO countries that has an interest in that part of the world, so hence the involvement in Libya. But although NATO had talked about several years ago the idea of having more of a global outreach, I just frankly, I don't see an appetite for that. I go to Brussels every now and then, and I know that there's been some NATO military missions that have gone and had talks in Beijing, and they've been to Tokyo.
And I chide them and say that that seems to be a bit of military tourism going on when you look at what the resources of NATO are and what they really need to be attending to. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that's got an interesting history behind it. I'm not sure longer term how much viability that has as well, because I think you're going to find increasing tension between the Russian CSTO and Chinese SCO, with Russian membership in SCO. But I believe that what will start to emerge over the next decade is more manifest signs of tension and differences between Russia and China in Central Asia and extending into parts of South Asia. So I don't give any of them, I don't have expectations that either one of them will have a real great future, although China, I think, will continue to invest heavily in SCO, but may find themselves with some pushback.
There's a question here.
Thank you. My name is Yan at Kennedy School. I'm a civil servant in China, National Bureau of Statistics. I'm a visiting fellow at Kennedy School. My question is concerned with the future. According to the modern military principle, maybe joint exercise between different countries, most important management of military cooperation. But compared with that between America and Japan, as well as the South Korea, the joint exercise between China and America are very few. So presumably, if the amount of annual military joint exercise take the lead in the world, what does it imply? What does it mean to the world? Do you think it's possible or impossible mission? That's my question.
Yeah, I've said before, in fact, talking to Dr. Vogel this afternoon, that it's interesting, the farther you get away from China's borders globally, say going to the Gulf of Aden, it's surprising the amount of positive possibilities there are between the United States military and China. We just conducted a very successful second counter-piracy exercise between the United States Navy and the PLA Navy in the Gulf of Aden. I just talked to some friends in the Office of Secretary of Defense, and they told me that there are some very promising developments in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief cooperation. We've gone beyond a PowerPoint slide exchange with the PLA some years ago to a tabletop exercise. Now we're actually talking about going out and doing an exercise together. So what do those exercises do? First, I think they do you're right, they send a good signal to the world and to the region that there's dialogue going on between our two militaries. We're working hard as nations to find patterns of cooperation. We also, on both sides, at a very grassroots level, are hopefully starting to develop officers and non-commissioned officers and petty officers of the militaries of both sides that aren't demonizing the other side. They're actually out there working together, doing things together. And those young officers who are lieutenants today, 20 years later, they'll be in much more senior positions, so those are good investments. But as I've tried to emphasize in this talk, that does not substitute for the problems that come, trying to solve the problems that come from these very fundamental differences in our core interest. So China's interests right now are expanding. And they're expanding not because China's ambitious,
They may be ambitious. They're expanding because China's power and capabilities are expanding. And so their interests are going to expand over time, of course. And as they look at the Western Pacific area, they have real concerns in their mind about how that regional security architecture is ordered. It's ordered right now in their minds through a bunch of antiquated alliances, products of the Cold War, and the United States gets to define the rules of the road off of China's coast in the Western Pacific. So I think that it's important to look then at these questions of maritime disputes, that the United States has a vested interest in making sure they're not solved in certain ways that China would like to have them solved. As they look at Taiwan today, and they add all of this up, and I think that what we're seeing many times is more than reactions from China that are symptomatic of a nation that wants to sit down and redefine some of the rules of the road that are out there and understandings. And I said in the presentation, it's at our peril that we look at each one of these symptoms and say, that's the problem, that's it right there. As long as we sit down and talk very specifically about Taiwan, as long as we talk very specifically about the South China Sea, as long as we talk very specifically about the East China Sea, and then create an environment out there where there's just a lot of good cooperation, that will resolve the problem. This gets back to the question that gets written about by political science and goes back to the days of Thucydides about a rising power against status quo power, and at some point in time, the two powers need to sit down and they need to have frank talks between themselves.
So the moment has come when you get a question from your old teacher. President Vogel.
Well, you may have summarized the points already, but you talked about the 20% where we have, the 20% where we have real, difference of interest. And maybe you summarized those as South China Seas, the Taiwan, perhaps the Korean Peninsula also. I wonder if you want to just sort of summarize where you see those, the nubs of the issues that we really need to work on in these dialogues that you spoke so eloquently about.
I was afraid that Ezra was going to remind me that a paper that he had assigned me in 1980 still hadn't been turned in.
Turned them all in, you did very well.
Is there a paper you turned in that he failed to return to you?
Ezra, first on the points of contention. I didn't really explain to the audience here about the military maritime challenges that we're facing with China right now. This goes beyond rules of the road and how to operate. We have profound differences in how we interpret jurisdictions and authorities and responsibilities that go with various claims. Let me give you an example. Chinese interpretation of their exclusive economic zone, which goes well beyond the 12-mile nautical limit recognized under the UN Law of the Sea Convention, that the Chinese interpretation, and they're in a minority in the world, but some share the view that your EEZ, legitimate, recognized that the way they interpret then the EEZ is that if you're a foreign military power, you can't transit through that EEZ without prior notification, and you cannot conduct military activities within that EEZ. Why is that important to the United States of America? Because we have always been, since our very early days, a maritime power. And over the last 100 years, that maritime dominance globally, or the ability to concentrate maritime power and go where we want, that's been assumed in terms of our doctrine, but it's also been assumed in our way then of operating economically. It is important to the United States. So if China then, with their interpretation of EEZ, what does that mean? Because we don't know exactly what the Chinese claims in the South China Sea mean, it could conceivably mean that the United States Navy loses access to the South China Sea without first requesting permission from Beijing to go through. It's a huge body of water. 80% of China's trade goes through the South China Sea. Most of Japan's trade goes through the South China Sea. It's important to us as well in terms of transit through into the Straits of Malacca. These are not trivial problems. So you'd think that, say, well, why should the United States then get too engaged in discussions about coral reefs and rocks? We don't want to go to war over coral reefs and rocks. But the stakes are actually quite high. So that's the first point, Ezra, about then where are the equities for us? I think the equities actually do get back to freedom of navigation. In terms of the candor of the dialogue, though, we're just not there yet. The United States will say, this is about freedom of navigation. We really don't care about the territorial disputes. We don't take sides on this. We don't care about sovereignty. But we really do, in a sense, we care about outcomes there that could be very adverse to us. So have dialogues with China where also China sits down and says that here's our view of EEZ, and by the way, that we're not blinking on this. EEZs, for now and forever, our interpretation will be that there's restrictions on military activities. We're just not having those conversations. The United States wants to talk about rules of the road. China wants to talk about its EEZ prerogatives. With regard to the Korea Peninsula, I'd be more optimistic there, Ezra, that the possibility for more productive dialogue could take place. I think that, as we all know, Beijing's patience with North Korea has perhaps reaching some limits. On the other hand, it gets back to what Chinese ambitions are or Chinese interests are in the Western Pacific. Part of the stumbling block, I think, on productive dialogue on Korea is the Chinese nervousness that if you have a collapse of North Korea, then we know with the collapse of North Korea, it's going to be reunified on South Korea, the Republic of Korea's terms. And then is Beijing better or worse off with having with having Kim Jong-un throwing tantrums occasionally, or is it better to live with that, or is it better to risk implosion on the Korean Peninsula and then have a Korea reunified that's got a strong alliance with the United States of America? That, of course, is very difficult to talk to China about because both sides are not very confident about their ability to keep dialogues confidential, and China doesn't probably want to have that kind of dialogue as well. Now, I know we're getting short on time, and I also, though, don't want to leave this audience with the notion that my view is that this relationship with China is fraught with very severe problems, and emphasis I placed on problem areas. I don't want to discount the possibilities, I said earlier, as China's capabilities grow and its interests become more global, that they might start to attribute, and we might start to attribute, more value to keeping productive cooperation on some of those global issues. I really do believe their acceptance of RIMPAC was positive, that joint exercise, and I think it's very much a function of them getting more self-confidence. So with them more self-confidence, with more global interest, perhaps the possibility that some of those dialogues will help mitigate risk in other issue areas, because I'm sure that right now in the PLA and in the senior partyship level, there's got to be somebody who's being irreverent and saying we really don't want to go to war with the Americans over a bunch of coral reefs and rocks, do we?
So with that, I think we will have to bring the proceedings to an end. And whether we think that the size of the American military budget, how big the blue ball is, whether that's something to be worried about or encouraged by, leave that open. But one thing that is encouraging, I think, is that the discussions about the relationship between the United States and China, and its military aspect and other aspects as well, is being handled by people with some kind of level-headed sang-froid and knowledge, inside knowledge of things, such as we've seen from Ambassador Eikenberry today. That's a very encouraging thing. And thank you very, very much for a wonderful set of remarks and for answering our questions.
Thank you. It's really been a privilege. Thank you.